Nobody gets rich in academia, but I work 6 hours a week, and I make a six-figure salary. Plus, Washington is full of opportunities for outside consulting, so I'm not complaining. Janet, my wife of 12 years, also works at the university. She started as an administrative assistant, but the girl was too talented for small roles. She is now the development director. For those who don't know, academic language development is what we nerds call begging. Janet is essentially asking alumni for money, and she can charm the birds that come down from the trees. Who wouldn't want to hand a big check to Janet? At the age of 37, she is still absolutely gorgeous. Her dark features and curves are in keeping with her Italian heritage. She is also a very smart woman, well-read, cultured, and funny as hell. In fact, her sense of humor is what people remember most about her. But in the world of fundraising, the main source of income is her breasts. She told me that her magnificent breasts gave her a lot of trouble, mainly because they required extra care and attention. But she also openly admits that it opens a lot of doors for her. For example, I remember one evening when we were with a donation applicant. The guy was 60 years old and incredibly rich. The woman with him was his first wife, about his age and plain. The potential donor eyed Janet like a puppy in a store window. This was not uncommon. The whole point is to have someone like Janet handle the requests because she is amazingly attractive. As the evening continued, the man became more and more intrusive. He couldn't take his eyes off the half-foot of cleavage visible from her little black dress. His wife, who had arrived looking bored, now looked disgusted. At the same time, Janet ignored his excessive attention and listened carefully to his every word. I sat opposite her, and my wife winked at me in a way that was both secretly funny and so shameless that it could melt my feelings. She was clearly saying, "Do you see this guy?" This was my Janet, worked and played at the same time. She left with a big check. My reward was waiting for me when we returned home. I didn't marry Janet until my late 20s, and I had many women before her. But I've never met a woman who was as wild in bed as she was. Luckily, the next day was Saturday. Some people garden, fish, or play golf on the weekends. We love sailing. We keep the Sea and Sea Cruising 40 in the Washington Marina and usually go on weekends around Potomac and into the Chesapeake Bay. Janet is a great swimming partner, and with the power boosters, we can get anywhere on our own. There's nothing more romantic than sitting at anchor in one of the bays, watching the summer sun set over the Chesapeake, and enjoying blue crab and a cold bottle of Pinot Grigio. And there's nothing cozier than lying wrapped in a blanket in the cockpit of our boat, watching the stars and talking about a million things. Janet is not just my wife. She has always been my best friend and close comrade, and to say that I love her would be an understatement. The university launched a major fundraising campaign this fall. This reduced our sailing time. Janet began to commit 3-day trips to large populated areas. Usually, her team members were engaged in refreshments and entertainment, and she carried out the actual requests. But this campaign was a big deal. She was therefore expected to accompany her subordinates to demonstrate the university's commitment to the process. This was fine for me since I was also busy doing my own thing with NCTC in McLean. This all took longer than we both wanted. In fact, the demands on my time were almost the same as if I had a real job. They planned to end the campaign in New York in mid-March. This was supposed to be a 4-day celebration because many of our graduates live in greater New York. Janet stood in our bedroom, sorting through the contents of her rolling bag. She looked like she was trying to decide if she had packed everything. I watched her from the doorway. She is a beautiful woman. But when she puts on makeup for the public, she looks especially stunning. She is of average height, and her long raven hair was pulled back into one of those stylish ponytails favored by fashionable women. It made her look menacingly slim and businesslike, and with that gorgeous face and perfect little body, she was a sight to be admired. When I approached her from behind, she was chewing her lower lip as if trying to decide something. I said cheerfully, "Have you packed everything?" She said, almost wistfully, Have you ever wanted to just give it all up and be a scourge in St. Lucia? I answered easily. The boat is fueled and ready. Do you want to leave right now? She turned around, put her arms around my neck, and looked at me intently. It seemed like she was trying to remember my face. Strange reaction. Then she smiled brightly and said, "As soon as this campaign is over, I will take you to some desert island. Count on it." I thought about starting something, but we both had plans. She called a taxi to Union Station to Kachesla, and I had a meeting at NCTC with several gentlemen from a small company in Langley. Highway 66 wasn't completely blocked this time, so I got there and finished my business much earlier than expected. It was only 1:05 p.m., and I knew Janet's train didn't leave until 2:15 p.m. I had time to surprise her, so I raced down the George Washington Parkway and across the Potomac onto us 1 to E Street and Union Station. It was mid-afternoon, and I parked and crossed the upper gallery at exactly 1:55 p.m. I bought a bouquet from a flower seller near the escalators. I planned to give her a small, spontaneous farewell gesture. I just wanted to remind her how special she is to me. I know it was stupidly romantic, but our jobs have kept us apart for too much of the last 6 months. I approached the boarding area for Acela when I saw her dragging her rolling bag towards the first-class carriage. She literally glowed with confident femininity. I thought to myself, God, she's so hot. I couldn't go down the platform without a ticket, so I stopped at the gate. Damn, I just missed her. Then something strange happened. As I watched her walk, she reached out and took the hand of the tall man walking next to her. It was an intimate gesture, as if there was more between them than just being neighbors on a trip. It didn't make sense. When they turned to enter the carriage, I saw that it was Todd Breckenridge. Todd is the vice president of development and Janet's boss. Essentially, he is the university's marketing and sales manager. I thought to myself, this is really weird. If he was going to Manhattan with her, do you think she would mention it? I knew Todd from the events I was dragged to. He always seemed too smooth and arrogant. He always looked down on us academicians. It was as if he thought that we did not understand how the real world worked, which was mutual because I treated him with the same disdain. He may have been a handsome and very confident preppy guy, but he wasn't particularly smart, and I consult in the field of counterterrorism, so I have an idea. I knew Janet had to interact with him at work, but I got the impression that she thought he was a jerk. Todd helped Janet up into the carriage and handed her the bag. I didn't like how long his hands lingered on her when he did this. I walked back to the parking lot with mice gnawing on my brainstem. It bothered me a little that she didn't mention that she was traveling with Todd. It made sense that he would accompany Janet on this trip. It was a grand conclusion to an important campaign. I just wish she would have told me about it. Of course, perhaps her forgetfulness was due to the fact that the asshole is known for his love affairs. His wife kicked him out for cheating, and he has been relentlessly harassing everyone in a dress ever since. Maybe she thought I'd be less worried if I didn't know she'd be in a strange city with that predatory jerk. In that regard, I could understand why she didn't tell me about it. I felt bouts of jealousy just thinking about what I saw on the platform. This bothered me so much that I called my friend Eddie. Eddie, not Edward or Ed, is the vice president of it at the university. He runs in the same circles as Todd and Janet. I wanted to know his opinion about their relationship. We met for beer at the Martin Tavern, which is located near my house. Over the 75 years of its existence, Martin has made many political deals and transferred a lot of classified information. This time was no exception. Eddie is a calm guy. He oversees a large budget at the university, and one would expect him to be a cold bureaucrat. But he's a West Virginia guy by origin, and it's as rural as a foggy morning gorge. He is also tall, about 2 meters, so he stood out when he entered. I waved to him. I already had my pitcher of beer and poured him a mug. He looked at me with bewilderment, sat down, and slowly said, "John, I haven't seen you for a long time. What happened?" I don't know if I mentioned it, but he plays the hillbilly role to the extreme. I got straight to the point. I said, I'm interested in Janet and Todd Breckenridge. He knew them both very well because he had attended many meetings with the development department. He stopped and thought, trying to carefully formulate what he was going to say. He said slowly, well, they've gotten a lot closer lately. He's definitely a skirt chaser, and it looks like he's got his sights set on her. She hasn't given him anything yet, as far as I can tell, but he keeps trying, and he's got her. Immediate superior. I tried not to look as shocked as I felt. I said, so let me get this straight. Breckenridge Janet persistently pursues, and she can't directly tell him to leave because he is her immediate superior. Is that what you're telling me? He looked at me with the penetrating eyes of a simple man and said, aha, that's exactly what I'm telling you. We spent the rest of the evening discussing technical things. We all play roles when we are with other people. It is the way we filter how others perceive us. When it comes to playing a West Virginia farmer, Eddie is perhaps a little more over the top than Jed Clampett, but he has a PhD from MIT, and his specialization coincides with my field, so we had a lot to talk about. I walked back home on a beautiful April evening, feeling very restless. I saw them together, and Janet didn't look like she was putting any barriers between herself and this guy. In fact, if you saw the two of them walking to the train, you would think that she and him were like a couple. She has made numerous fundraising trips over the past 6 months. I wondered how many of them her boss did with her. It made sense that the most important development man and his deputy would travel together for the final event of the campaign. But the situation was too convenient if love games were on the agenda. It was quite late in the evening, and it was time for my call. I dialed Janet's number on her cell phone, and she answered immediately. She sounded as bright and loving as ever. I said, hello, my love. Time to put you to bed. She laughed and said, why don't you come here to Manhattan and give me a good nap? I replied, I'd love to, but you have a lot of work to do. I'll have to settle for doing this as soon as you get home and for the rest of your life. She laughed again. I was going to mention Breckenridge, but it seemed inappropriate. I would sound like a jealous wimp complaining about her boss being there. More importantly, I had reached a point where I wanted to investigate the situation more thoroughly, so I didn't want to warn her. Suspicion is an insidious disease. Once you get infected, you will never get rid of it. Suspicion also makes you do mean things. I suddenly desperately wanted to find a cure. As a first test, I called the hotel and asked to be connected to her number. I would make it sound casual, that is, if she answered. But the phone took forever to ring. I tried again an hour later. Same result. This didn't prove anything. She could still work. But there was another explanation. This sent shivers down my spine. I was in a panic. However, I am ashamed of what I did next. My only excuse was that I needed to find out, and it was ridiculously easy to find out. Thanks to a new generation of malware, you don't have to sneak around to spy on someone. Malware makes old-fashioned listening devices and video cameras look woefully outdated, just like they were in the 1990s. She was 200 miles away in Manhattan, but what I planned to do would make me invisible in her room, and I would never leave the comfort of my desk while I was doing it. I composed a regular email to Janet. It read, "Can you take a look at this contract when you have time? I need your opinion by tomorrow. What do you think?" And I attached a PDF with a copy of the consulting contract that we already talked about. Janet was in finance. Therefore, she was the right family member to handle contracts. We have already discussed the terms of the contract. She just needed to watch it. And since Janet was in fundraising, not computer technology, she would never have noticed the extra 20 megabytes of something very nasty she was downloading. These extra lines of code were a piece of evil I picked up from my friends at the George W. Bush Center. The virus is known by the mundane name Flame. It was in circulation for a couple of years, but I had the armed version, the same one that a certain state used against the Iranians. Flame is one of approximately 100,000 reasons why the internet has completely changed the reality of our world, especially when it comes to personal privacy. Essentially, I sent my supposedly innocent wife spyware that turned her laptop into my own remote surveillance device. Basically, I could stand where her laptop was, and he could observe everything that happened within the range of his camera and microphone. This trick took just one click of my mouse. She didn't load or respond to it until late the next day. For that matter, her return email told me that I now owned her computer. I activated the virus as soon as I saw that it was enabled. The image and sound appeared as if I was standing in the room. Most people staying in a hotel room keep their laptop open on a shelf on the wall opposite the bed. This shelf is an architectural standard in every hotel room, as it also houses the TV. The laptop was accidentally turned on, although I could have turned it on if I needed to. His orientation was focused on the bed. How wonderfully successful. Now I was watching her room in real time. I could hear the shower running. Janet then walked past the camera and sat down to dry her hair. From the dialogue, I realized that they had just gotten out of the shower in Breckenridge. Every alarm in my brain went off at once. I even screamed, "What the hell is he doing there?" Of course, she didn't hear me. The answer was painfully obvious. They made love. Seriously, I had enough of watching. I have set the device to record. Most of you have probably experienced events in your life that were so overwhelming that you couldn't comprehend them. For example, the death of a loved one, an unexpected layoff, or the discovery that the woman you loved and expected to grow old with turns out to be a cheater. Some of you may cry. Some may hit something. Others may get drunk. In my case, my vision began to flicker, and I fell into a state of stupor. I didn't faint, per se. It was more like a coma or just death. I didn't realize what was happening. But to preserve myself, my mind retreated deep into its psychic bomb shelter. All internal systems from consciousness to basic emotions simply turned off. I was like a zombie. I came out of this state still sitting in front of my workstation. I didn't sleep and didn't even lean in my chair. But the sun was shining brightly outside, so it was clear the next day. I looked at my watch. I sat upright in my chair for about 9 o'clock. My muscles ached, and it took me a few minutes to warm up enough to be able to walk. I returned to awareness of the world around me, but all my internal structures burned to the ground. I was empty inside. I don't know how others might react to what I just saw, but I was completely devastated. You live in one version of reality, and when the picture changes, it is difficult to quickly move to a new universe. Well, give me a break. As far as I knew, Janet had been my best friend and loving wife for the last 380 days. This alternate reality was just a one-day thing. My thoughts were almost comically banal. How could she do this? How often did she do this? And every cuckold's favorite question, how many other men has she had? Denial is the first stage of grief. You try to interpret what you saw, but I had a huge MP4 documenting the facts in gorgeous high definition and digital audio. It was hard to deny. Janet was not in her room. She and the bastard had to be at work somewhere, or maybe they had sex in another room. It didn't matter anyway. I sent a command to destroy the virus and turned off the connection. They'll never know how I did it. It will take time to review all the recording material. They say you should never look at your spouse cheating if you ever plan to reconcile. This was not a problem for me since we were finished. The only question that remained was how to take a break. It is not the betrayal of trust that affects you so much as the feeling that your fundamental assumptions about the inevitability of your marriage and even your life are incorrect. There are things in everyone's life that we simply consider as given. At the top of this list is the belief that both partners in a marriage will remain faithful. If you are a normal person, it never occurs to you to think otherwise. So when you see that basic assumption shattered, you begin to question all the other things you assumed for granted, and it is a very dark and lonely path. I was already on this path at that point. I knew to my bones that reconciliation with Janet was impossible, so I planned to treat everything I wrote down as just information. This would be ammunition for what I now needed, an absolute scorched earth, an absolute knife war. Revenge is such a cleansing feeling. It focuses and guides you through the maelstrom of less practical emotions that swirl around you when you are betrayed, as I just was. Revenge makes you feel less helpless and lost. More importantly, it allows you to take back control. I took a shower and got dressed. My rational mind had already formulated a plan. I alternated between wild outbursts of anger and the absence of any feelings. I was a little worried about the latter condition, because I couldn't laugh, cry, or even feel impatient with the idiots in DC traffic. If there was any feeling there at all, it was a feeling of absolute ruthlessness. I hoped that this condition would pass. Being completely ruthless helps get me through the shock, but somehow I will have to move on with my life. And spending the rest of my life obsessed with how to get back at these two seemed just as completely screwed up. I headed to the bank and then to my lawyer Bernie's office. First, I did the usual financial protection cliches. I divided our liquid assets and separated bonds and stocks. I put my entire share in another bank and left the rest in our joint account for Janet. Bernie is a friend of mine from college. He was born to be a lawyer, and he always handled all my legal matters. He's an absolutely nice guy and a lover of Jewish humor, so he also has fun drinking beer. I told him what happened and what evidence I had. I told him there was no chance I could stay married to Janet, so I asked him to prepare what he thought was a fair divorce proposal. He looked at me with sympathy and said, "Are you sure this is what you want to do? This is very hasty. You and Janet are the perfect couple, and as far as I know, she loves you. I can't imagine any circumstances that would cause her to do what you described. Have you talked to her about this?" I said, "I don't need to talk to her. I saw it, and I don't care why. The sooner I put this behind me, the better. I need to get rid of my overwhelming feelings of anger, loneliness, and distress over her betrayal." Then I burst into tears. Bernie's office must have called it. It seemed that I had reached a safe harbor after battling a terrible storm. And it was damn humiliating. I only cried once in my life. This was when my mother died. Even then, it was something I expected, and I acted less like a little girl. This time it caught me off guard, and I just couldn't cope. I was absolutely overwhelmed by my deep personal pain. 3 days ago, I was a happily married man whose wife was my best friend, comrade, and lover. This was obviously an illusion. I didn't even know the woman in the video. It felt like I was living my life in two parallel universes. There was a dimension where we were a happy, respectful couple, and then there was a dimension where I was always a miserable fool. I suspected I knew the answer to this question. Bernie didn't expect me to act like such a crybaby. How could he? I'm always so controlled and rational. He screamed at his secretary in panic. Gladys is a kind and caring older woman. She assembled the picture in a few nanoseconds. She knew what lawyers did. She grabbed a pile of paper towels from Bernie's bathroom and handed them to me one at a time, holding my head on her generous motherly chest and making comforting sounds. I finally stopped whining. Did I mention how humiliating this was? But it really helped me when I let it out. I looked at Bernie apologetically for my fit and said, "You know what I need to do." God, after the exhibition I just put on, he would be completely brainless not to understand what I needed from him. I said, "This is a no-fault jurisdiction, so file irreconcilable differences, but let her lawyer know that if she resists, I have all the evidence I need to destroy her personally and professionally. I want this to end quickly." Bernie said, "No problem. I can have the papers ready by tomorrow afternoon. Is that what you want? Where do you want her to be served with the lawsuit?" I replied, "She will be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. I would like her to be served with the claim at home as soon as possible after that. I will leave something that will make the reasons for divorce self-evident." He nodded, and I headed home to the hardest part. I recorded too much of her sex and conversations afterwards to make an effective documentary. So I created a best moments version of her night with the jerk, just to highlight the key points. But to do this, I had to watch almost 5 hours of the most heartbreaking things to find 15 golden minutes. Bernie asked me if rushing to divorce was a reasonable response after 12 good years. I wondered this too until I actually made a demo video. After watching her enjoy her little sex holiday, all I could think about was getting away from this bitch as quickly as possible. Janet is a passionate woman, and it clearly showed. I've heard that some men like to watch their wives having sex. It repulsed me. I have always considered myself a rational and reasonable person. But after what I had witnessed, a particularly brutal murder seemed like a possible option. I gathered all my things and loaded them into the car. There was nothing I wanted to take from this house, except my clothes and a few personal items. I left the proofs running in a loop on the workstation. Of course, I took the new show with me and the raw data on a portable drive. Then I closed the door on the last decade of my life. I left a simple note leaning against the monitor. It read, "I'm sorry you chose to do this to me, and I apologize for any mistakes I made in our relationship. I loved you with all my heart. I will always appreciate what we had as husband and wife, but there is no turning back from this betrayal. If you have not yet been served with a lawsuit when you read this, they will in a few minutes. I tried to be as fair as possible in the proposal for division, and I hope you will not challenge it. The sooner I get rid of you from my life, the faster I can move on. I need time to heal, so I ask that you respect me enough not to try to contact me. If we see each other on campus, I ask you to go the other way. I may never stop loving you, and I don't need a reminder of what I've lost. I wish you would appreciate it more. Maybe someday we can meet, and you can tell me why. Love, Billy Joe." I went to my new apartment. This was our boat. By that time, I had already recovered most of my mental functions, and the surrounding area was familiar, so I almost felt normal. That was until I thought about a bitch and her lover. Then I reconnected with my murderous side. I have always considered personal revenge to be a childish emotion best left to lesser minds. That was until it happened to me. Now I was a raging monster. I planned to inflict maximum pain on the bastard, and I knew exactly what it would take to make me completely satisfied. I wanted it to be an event of complete destruction of his life. But there was one more unresolved matter that I had to deal with first. I called Jill as soon as I finished moving to the boat. Jill had been Janet's best friend and confidant since college. She is married to Tom, who is definitely my best friend. Unlike Janet, I'm not particularly social, but I have a few people that I naturally gravitate towards. This is Tom and Jill. Both of them are very good people. Jill was glad I called. She said, "Hey, single guy, how about you come over for dinner so we can keep you out of the dating pool while your wife is away? We're grilling steaks." She had no idea how tragic and completely inappropriate that little remark was. I laughed and said, "I'd love to eat a steak and chat if you had time." An hour later, I was sitting in their backyard drinking beer and enjoying a perfectly cooked steak. They sat opposite me at the table. I said, "I have very important information for both of you. So, if it's possible, let's not joke." They both looked puzzled and a little worried. Jill said, "Of course, speak up." I looked her straight in the eye as I said, "Is there something you need to tell me about Janet?" The metal doors slammed shut, but before that, I saw a change in her eyes. This was undeniable. Jill was in no hurry to answer. She seemed to be carefully considering her answer. She said, "Janet is going through some difficult times. She loves you madly, but there are powerful, and I might add, sinister forces that she simply cannot ignore and that confuse her. She told me about it. But I'm guessing from your question that you already know what she's up against. That's all I know. But I also know that she fights with everything she has so that it doesn't upset you. Janet is a good person, and you are her one true love. She doesn't feel like she can discuss this with you without changing your relationship since she can't get out of this situation without quitting. But you have to understand that her current condition is really upsetting and embarrassing for her." I could tell from Jill's rationalizations that she was just as in the dark as I was. This will be of great importance for our future relationship. If she had known about the bastards and not told me, I would have been done with them too. I said, seriously? Well, it's very strange because she didn't seem embarrassed when I recorded her and her boss having sex. I just need you both to know that I am divorcing her. It fell on them like a meteor that destroyed the dinosaurs. In fact, it may have even been a little cruel. They are very good people and did not deserve to be told this suddenly. But my judgment was still a little impaired, at least as far as common sense is concerned. Both turned pale. Jill looked like she was going to faint. She stood her ground and said, "What did you just say? Are you divorcing Janet?" I replied, "The claim will be served tomorrow. I've left a video to illustrate the reason. It's pretty revealing, and don't ask how I did it." Perhaps Jill and Tom thought I had hired a private investigator. A very outdated idea. Jill muttered, "This will kill her. She loves you madly. I can't believe she betrayed you. Was this with Todd Breckenridge? He's the one who pressured her to have sex." I said, "Believe, baby," and she didn't seem particularly under pressure when she declined my call to focus on him. I was being deliberately crude to emphasize that old Billy Joe is dead and a new vengeful angel has risen in his place. Jill looked shocked. She was speechless. Tom came over and put his hand on my shoulder, squeezing me like a man. He then sat down again and said, "Is there anything we can do to help? We love you both, and I want you to know that we are here to support you no matter what." I said, "Thanks, mate." I then looked at Jill and said, "Janet will need you around 6:30 p.m. tomorrow night. I still love that bitch, even if I can never be married to her, and I want you to take good care of her. I will have a rational discussion once I have overcome my overwhelming desire to throw her body into the Potomac. But life is too short to hear about what could have been. I especially don't want to hear her say she's sorry." I told both of them that I valued our relationship, and that all I expect from them is to continue to follow the simple rules of friendship. I told them I would live on the boat until things calmed down. I asked Jill to make sure Janet didn't try to visit me there. I stood up and the three of us hugged. I walked to my car, trying not to look defeated. The only thing that kept me going was the knowledge that Breckenridge and Janet will experience the same gloomy outlook on life after tomorrow. The next morning, I woke up in the boat cabin. The world may have come to an end, but in Washington, it was still a bright and sunny April day. The boat was a little cramped, but quite comfortable, and for the foreseeable future, it will become home. The marina itself is like a village full of boat people, so the pier, even at such an early hour, was bustling with pedestrians coming and going. It was like I was living on the main street of a small town. There were about 27 voice messages on my phone. They were all from Janet. I felt like Jill called her. I deleted them en masse and went looking for breakfast. There is a hotel next to Marina. This is one of those cheap tourist traps, but they serve a buffet. I read Lent and got caught up in my day. I still had a lecture to give that morning, so I took the subway from Waterfront Sioux Station across town to the university. It was a long walk to Foggy Bottom, but it was one of those gorgeous spring days in Washington. The humidity had not yet set in, and the city around me was alive. I started thinking about the rest of my life. The first faint rays of hope began to illuminate my soul. Fast walking helped. Janet was history, but I was only 42 years old. Maybe I can find someone and start a family. I admired people. These are amazingly hardy creatures. It was only Thursday, and on Tuesday night I was a vegetable. It's amazing what 2 days of perspective will do for you. I finished the lecture and headed to the presidential administration. There were 12 more calls on my phone. I deleted them as I went. The president and I always got along. I bring in a ton of grant money, and it gets attention in the administration building. When I sat down, he prepared coffee or tea as usual. I politely declined. He said, "So what brings you here, Billy Joe? I hope for more funding." And he grinned at his own little joke. I said, I need to discuss a serious case of malfeasance with you." His eyes instantly became wild. "You should never utter the word malfeasance in the presence of the university rector. This strikes at the heart of their leadership." I had proof on the tablet computer I was holding in my hands. I would use it if necessary. I hoped I wouldn't have to. He said, "This is a very serious charge. Who are you blaming?" And he began to sort through the papers in front of him. It was a clear sign of excitement. I said, "The person I'm accusing is your vice president of marketing and university development." I could not bring myself to say the name of this scoundrel. I said, "I have evidence here," and pointed to my tablet, that he behaved inappropriately by having a secret relationship with one of his subordinates while representing the university to the donor community. I thought the president would feel bad when I said that. Donors are the people who keep university presidents on their thrones. Any inappropriate behavior in front of this group would threaten the position of the president himself. I said, "The other person is my wife, Janet." He turned pale, "And that's why I own it." I gave him 2 incriminating photographs. The president looked shocked. "Oh, I forgot about his vow of abstinence." He started reaching for the phone. Then I remembered that they were still in New York. As his hand hovered over the phone, I said in as neutral a voice as possible, "I believe the university should compensate me for my losses. Your failure to properly supervise your subordinates has cost me my marriage and my happiness." It was something he could handle. He removed his hand and took on the sly look of a chief executive officer. You could see him asking himself, "How much will it cost me to get rid of this problem?" I said, "You may be thinking that I am planning a civil suit, and that could still happen. But all you need to do to bury this problem forever are 2 simple things. First, fire Todd Breckenridge for gross misconduct, which you were probably going to do anyway. Secondly, promote my soon-to-be ex-wife to take his place." He looked paralyzed. He had no problem completing the first request. We both knew he was going to make the idiot disappear with extreme cruelty. It may not be like the good old days of the Inquisition, but the Jesuits are still very good at disappearing people who have become inconvenient. But why give Janet the big promotion? It didn't make sense to him. To help him make a decision, I said with all the false sincerity I could, "Of course I'm divorcing her, but I don't want to leave her without a livelihood. Breckenridge seduced her, so she's essentially the victim here." I didn't believe a word of it, but I had my own reasons for making him agree to my demand, and since he was a priest, I thought he might believe this particularly made-up version of the truth. It also emphasized my good guy status. My real motives were much less altruistic. I knew it would absolutely destroy Breckenridge being fired and then finding out that Janet took his place. He would have discovered my delicate hand in this, which is exactly what I hoped for. I also knew that Janet would suffer a lot of agonizing remorse if she was promoted for betraying me. Moreover, this would mean that she would earn more than me, hence no alimony. I wasn't going to pay this traitor a penny. Lastly, and sweeter, if she had just ousted this jerk from his job, it would probably prevent them from ever seeing each other again. It might even make him want to strangle her, which would be perfectly acceptable to me. How I became so vindictive is a mystery. But Janet's betrayal was one of those tectonic shifts that changed me, and the person who emerged from this cataclysm was a completely new, not particularly pleasant version of my old self. I believe karma has a way of balancing things out, and it was one of those golden moments. The president thought for a minute and then said, "Okay, we can do this. I don't think your wife should benefit from her immorality, but I can see how it would make them both extremely comfortable, which would be a fitting reward for their sins." Then he winked at me implicitly. The old man understood everything. He was quite astute for a man who had vowed never to marry. And after everything I'd been through, I started to think that maybe he had the right idea. I said, "Okay, we've come to an agreement. You'll fire Breckenridge tomorrow and officially promote Janet." He replied, "Until the evidence of their connection sees the light of day." I said, "You can count on it, because it is too humiliating for me personally. It may be shown in the judge's office during the divorce, but it is privileged information that cannot be legally disseminated. The old man actually patted me on the back as I left. He seemed almost gleeful at how gracefully we both carried out justice. The rest of the day passed without much of an event. I bought the necessary bachelor supplies, beer, and some good cigars. The real pain has not yet come in full force. This will happen when the endless parade of lonely days begins. I drank a six-pack and smoked a Dominican cohiba while sitting in the aft cockpit. I enjoyed the pain I was about to inflict on Janet. That thought was the only thing that kept me from tying one of the boat's anchors to my ankles and diving into the river. She was supposed to be returning home about now, and she will find all the wonderful gifts that I left for her. First, it will be my letter, accompanied by her little show. This would be followed by a divorce suit, and then a night where she would have to get used to life without me as her husband. I hoped she was suffering as much as I was. Anger and revenge are a great antidote when the only thoughts on your mind are how much you miss your wife and how much you still love her. Then the weight of injustice came crashing down on me like one of those cartoon safes, and I found myself in hysterics, screaming at the moon, "Why?" My God, how humiliating it was. Day 4 of the rest of my life promised another nice, sunny April day. I repeated my evening routine. Breakfast was satisfactory. The long walk from Foggy Bottom to the university was stimulating, and I absolutely coped with my lecture. The students looked appropriately admiring as they gathered their things and left. I was grateful that one part of me was still functioning, and that was the academic part. I have always been a researcher and a passionate teacher. This led to a successful career. Now I was ready to delve deeper into my work. It made me look forward to the future. What happened next was probably fate's way of compensating me for how she screwed me over the first time. I didn't plan this. This was purely an accident, but it was amazing. As I walked back down 37th Street, I passed in front of the dean's office. And who do I see if not two overweight campus police officers and Todd Breckenridge? They all seemed to be moving in the general direction of the parking lot. It looked like he was being escorted off campus for the last time. The moment he saw me, he started screaming, "You son of a bitch! I know you did it! You and that lying bitch!" And he broke free from his escort to rush at me. I saw him coming, and as he approached, I turned towards him with a completely smug grin on my face. I needed him to know how pleased I was. I could see what would happen next and made a split-second decision. I could use this. He attacked me. The first policeman took him away from me. The second policeman picked up my sunglasses and handed them to me. I looked at him gratefully and said in my humblest voice, "Thank you for saving me, officer." I was so scared. After I said that, I was afraid that I had put on too much horse manure. But the policeman looked stoic and said with false modesty, "You're welcome, just doing my job." My inner voice was laughing at the top of my lungs, but none of it was reflected in my eyes. He asked, "What do you want us to do with this guy, Professor Butler? Do you want to sue him?" It was getting better than I could have ever imagined. The crime should look great on this idiot's already tarnished resume. I said in my most indignant, highly civilized tone, "Of course, officer. This man attacked me in broad daylight right here on our campus. I will do my best to ensure order and civility here." I knew that sounded like a complete coward, but it was worth it. I'm playing the long game, and what's a little wasted short-term machismo if I can ruin this idiot's life forever? Playing the victim the way I did only made his unprovoked attack on me seem even more disgusting. He. My inner voice was thinking to myself, the moron might enjoy his 90 days in the DC jail. Then we can talk about a civil suit. I truly believe that karma balances things out somehow, and it was one of those golden moments. Sunday evening, I was sitting on the stern deck of the boat. It seems that the ritual with a six-pack and the cigar was going to become a daily event. The weather had warmed, and the cherry trees in the tide pool were in full bloom. It finally dawned on me that I was completely alone, and waves of sadness just washed over me. A dark despondency set in. At that moment, my phone rang. I trained myself to check my caller ID so I wouldn't accidentally answer one of Janet's calls. She stopped calling as often as before, but still called a couple times a day. I think it was just to stay on my radar. It was Jill, so I answered. She said, "Can we meet tomorrow for lunch?" I replied, "Of course, honey, as long as your husband doesn't mind his attractive wife having dinner with a lonely guy." She replied with some irritation, "You are not alone yet, and that is what I would like to talk about." A rush of anxiety flared up inside me. The last thing I wanted was to discuss Janet. I said, "You're not going to talk me into going back to her, are you? And if she's there when I get there, I'll turn around and leave." She replied, "I just want to update you on her condition and talk about what will happen next. I promise, no excuses, and I won't beg." I said, "Then let's meet at 2:15 at the Tombs. It's exam week, but I still need to eat." She said, "See you there." I didn't like her tone. It sounded like she was preparing for a confrontation. The next day I sat at the Tombs with a beer in front of me, admiring the scenery. The place really looked like a college diner, and the lunches were pretty good. Jill appeared at the door, and I waved to her. I forgot how much she looks like a less busty version of Janet. The sight of her pierced my heart like an arrow. She was wearing a simple black skirt and a white ruffled blouse. With such a sweet face, slender figure, and such clothes, she could easily pass for a student, although she graduated 15 years ago. She smiled, but her eyes remained sad as she walked over and sat down. She said, "How are you doing? I heard that Todd Breckenridge beat you up on Friday. Are you okay?" "He's still in the D.C. jail. They're treating it as a felony assault because the cops witnessed it, and they said he beat you up pretty bad. It's a crime, you know. He'll probably get jail time for it." He said, "I'd like to get a year for this." Ah, the benefits of good acting. I said, "The rumors about my death are a little exaggerated. How do you know all this?" In fact, I knew why she knew it, and this caused me a new wave of pain. But I wanted it confirmed. She said, "Because he called Janet to try to convince her to get him out of jail." She laughed at him and hung up. I poured Jill a beer from my mug and said, "So let's get down to business. I know you're not here for my irresistible charm and sex appeal." She smiled and said, "Well, if it weren't for my love for Tom, it might have been that way. But yes, I want to close this issue. I know you won't talk to Janet, but it's cruel to keep her in the dark like that. That's why I'm here on her behalf. She's absolutely destroyed, as you probably know. She never expected you to find out. But she also told me that she knew how smart you were and should have known you'd find a way." "By the way, what alarmed you?" I said, "If I hadn't tried to make a romantic gesture, I would still be a happy but cheated cuckold. And in some ways, I wish I had. I rushed to Union Station to surprise her with flowers before her trip and saw how she and Breckenridge got on the train. I didn't like the way they interacted with each other. I won't go into detail about how I caught them. It's too technical and boring. I saw everything they did and heard everything, including the conversations afterwards." Jill's eyes widened. She said, "Then you already know what happened. I don't need to explain." I said, "Well, I've learned most of it. Maybe you can explain to me how a woman can get so much pleasure from cheating." Jill looked disgusted. She said, "You know what I'm talking about. You know why she did it." I responded, and I really wasn't playing dumb. "I really don't know what you're talking about. And it was obvious why she did it. She loved all 5 hours. This I know." Jill said, "Didn't you realize from the pillow talk that she was in bed with this guy because he was finally pressuring her to sleep with him? This was the only time, and she did it because he promised her that if she did it once, he would leave her alone." This was perhaps the most personally offensive statement I have ever heard come out of anyone's mouth. Janet's excuse sounded more like a convenient ploy to avoid personal responsibility than a rational explanation. No one could have thought that I was so incredibly simple unless I was completely brain dead. My inner voice said, "Excuse me, she thinks I'm an idiot." Seriously, Jill must have been very faithful if she was willing to carry that bucket of manure here. Janet's explanation was so wonderfully selfish that I almost thought she believed it herself. And if she really thought she could ward off this bastard by sleeping with him, she was even stupider than her friend. I wanted to say, "Let me give you a more likely explanation." In Janet's head, this asshole who was pressuring her about sex gave her a handy, get-out-of-jail-free card to try something new. But Jill looked at me with sincerity. She really believed this crap. What a true friend, so I said, "This was never mentioned during their sex. I got the impression that they couldn't leave each other alone." Jill said, "She hates this guy. Everything you saw was her attempt to document case sexual harassment. She even wrote it all down to use as evidence. She would never say anything encouraging because she was trying to catch him." This I was forced to challenge. I said, "There were about 10 ways to do it without sleeping with him. It was just an excuse to taste another man." However, now that I thought about it, her tone did seem aimed at establishing that she was under pressure here. But whatever she was thinking when she turned our marriage vows into burnt toilet paper didn't matter. The fact is that she did it. Janet was clearly trying to win me back, convincing me that her night of cheating was an act of desperation, an attempt to build a case against the guy who was harassing her. This really made me angry, and there was nothing they could say or do to fix it. Janet always thought she was smarter than everyone, including me, and in most cases, this was true. I guessed that she had come up with her little plan and felt quite comfortable going through with it because she had really convinced herself that it was a way to keep this jerk off while she had a little harmless fun on the side. This seemed to be entirely Janet's style. She thought she would have proof to hold over the guy, and it would never hurt me because I would never know about it. In fact, if I hadn't seen them together at the station, this probably would have happened. I was even willing to accept the assumption that this was a one-time thing and would never happen again, because the prospect was immaterial. The problem is that it happened, and I witnessed this. Even worse, I've seen it multiple times in high definition. My inner voice mockingly commented, "They really should have turned off the lights." I said, "How does this affect me? This won't change my mind about divorcing her, and I'm sure the courts will be on my side as cheating is still a valid reason. I couldn't take her back after what I saw. Honestly, I don't even want to look at her, let alone talk to her." Jill said, "If you won't put up, why did you get her promoted? You got her out of trouble and promoted her to his position. Why did you do this if you don't love her? It does not make sense." I said, "Excuse me. I love her with all my heart, whatever that means, and there is no other woman in the world for me. What I did was so that she could live the rest of her life without me. It was done out of love. But she will have to understand and accept that she destroyed our marriage and destroyed me as collateral damage." I didn't want to tell her that the promotion was just my way of making sure I didn't have to give the bitch anything. This might make me sound a little less noble. Tell her to move on with my best wishes. But I never want to see her again. I'm going to take a year off to highlight this. The university owes me this, and when I return, I will start my life as if it never existed. Jill looked beaten. I didn't want to hurt her, but I needed to convey to her and Janet that they were killing me by prolonging the agony. I said as gently as I could, "You and Tom are my friends. Please don't think that I feel anything other than love and admiration for you. But tell Janet not to resist the divorce. She will get a house and a good allowance. And now she is a high-ranking official. She is a beautiful woman and will find someone to replace me. Unfortunately, this will not be so easy for me to do. So please be so kind as to leave me alone and let me try to start again." Jill smiled sympathetically, but she said bitterly, "I will do it, and I'll convince Janet to do the same. But you are wrong about one thing. She will not replace you. She has never loved anyone but you and will always love you. No one will ever take your place in her heart." Jill then stood up, straightened her dress, and squeezed my forearm. She said, "I will tell her everything you said, but I hope you understand that Janet didn't want any of this to happen, and she regrets it with all her heart." I said, "I'll take your words on faith, but it doesn't change anything. There is no way that we can have a relationship like spouses now." I threw a few coins on the table and we walked out together. I walked slowly back to the boat, where sadness fought with rage for the right to control the ship. There are 4 good reasons to teach: May, June, July, and August. These are the months when you are not working under a contract, but still receive a salary. In addition, I negotiated a year's paid sabbatical, which meant I didn't have to return to the mine until the following fall. And I knew where I was going: St. Lucia in the Windy Islands. You're absolutely right. This was my wife's last wish. So yes, it was a tribute to our marriage. What can I say? I'm sentimental. I actually saw Janet once before I left. I had a large morning lecture, almost 300 students. I do like admiring crowds. They all sat there, listening to me and frantically taking notes, while the teaching assistants walked through the seething mass like shepherds with dogs. I was in full swing when I looked up at the top of the audience and nearly choked on my tongue. Janet stood at the door, looking broken. This was the first time I saw her in the flesh since I saw her get on the train with that idiot. The beauty was dazzling. I felt 40,000 volts pass through me. This completely threw me off track. I stopped talking and just stood there at the pulpit like an idiot. I didn't want her to see how much the sight of her affected me, but my lips moved like a fish out of water. Nothing came out of my mouth for a good 2 minutes. The students all looked at me in confusion. I was almost afraid that one of them would raise their hand and ask if I was swallowing in the test. I took a sip of water and took a deep breath, then continued. When I looked up again, she had already left. I felt like I needed someone to love, and who would love me unconditionally. So, of course, I did the only reasonable thing. I went to the Washington shelter and adopted the dog. The one I chose was perfect. He was what people call a brown dog, which meant that he had so many breeds in him that his main characteristic was that he was brown. He was big and looked like he had a mastiff in his bloodline, but he had the face of a Labrador and the long ears of some kind of hound. He had short fur, a very wide back, and his tail was docked. The other dogs barked at the front of the cage, trying to get my attention. This guy stood with his back to me, showing complete humiliation and shame. It was as if he was saying, "Don't look at me, boss. I'm too ashamed." My heart responded to his suffering. We were very similar. I picked him up the next day after a bath and vet check. The delay was mainly so they could rid his manhood. I thought with dark humor, Janet did this to me. Now we are completely alike. He had a wonderful character. Slow, gentle, and loving, but not pushy like a small dog. He just sat next to me in the passenger seat, looking at me devotedly, puffing, 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 drooling. "Thanks for getting me out of there, boss. Now you can count on me for everything." I decided to name him Buddy because he was my buddy. He spent a couple of days getting used to the boat. We were going on a long trip, and I wanted him to feel comfortable. We were already packed and fully supplied, so all that remained was to set sail. Sailing a 40-foot yacht alone could be challenging, but I had diesels, and once we were out on the open sea, I could raise the mainsail from the cockpit using the motor. We headed down Potomac by motor, and when we got out into the bay, I sailed around Norfolk and the International Channel. May is a good time for sailing, and Buddy and I moved along the coast to Miami and the open ocean beyond. I left a wounded man, but I was going to spend the next 16 months nursing my wounds. We moored at Rodney Bay Marina. This is one of those full-service marinas that offers everything from diesel to upscale shopping. Therefore, it attracts many tourists. Buddy and I sat in the cockpit in the already scorching morning sun. I drank coffee and watched what was happening. He was looking at something that dogs look at when they stare into space and puff. In the 10 months since my divorce, Buddy had gone from traveling companion to best friend. I entrusted all the divorce matters to my lawyer Bernie, and Bernie made sure that we both got through this sad event with a minimum of dignity. Moreover, he did it quickly and without any hassle for me. As a result, I now thought about Janet only 20 times a day. In the year that I have sailed from the marina in Washington, I have completely deconstructed the boring guy I used to be, and replaced it with the inner sea tramp that I always knew was lurking somewhere. I was outside in the tropical sun, doing all the work that needs to be done to keep the boat in good condition. It gave me a deep tan. My naturally blonde, well-coiffed hair was long and wild, bleached almost white, and my sedentary body became slim to the bone. I even boasted a 43-year-old version of the six-pack. I lived in a pair of boat shorts. I wore a t-shirt and a cap when I dressed for the public. Looking in the mirror, I thought, if Onla Janet could see me now. I didn't recognize myself. I earned money giving boat tours. I have taken tourists on day hikes and explorations of nearby islands. I had enough to live on my regular salary, but I didn't have the luxury of not doing tours. It didn't make me rich, but I could probably live there the rest of my life at some level of comfort. I could afford real Cuban Cohiba cigars, and staying in St. Lucia became an increasingly tempting prospect. Jean-Claude was my agent. He was a cheerful man who lived somewhere near Soufriere and spent his time on the beaches, selling entertainment to tourists among his other goods. In fact, tours were one of the more respectable forms of his business. I met him during my first week in St. Lucia. I had booked a mooring spot in Rodney Bay for the duration of my stay, and there was a place near the marina called Spinacres that had just the right amount of casualness. It was also convenient because I could crawl back to the boat if I had too much to drink. The feature that sold me was that they let Buddy sit with me on their outdoor deck. After all, the island is French. I spent every evening there since my arrival, trying to understand the local situation. Jean-Claude came up and introduced himself about a week after I arrived and started hanging out there. It was jet black, and he had one of those lively personalities that would make Bobby McFerrin seem extremely humorless. He wore a tousled island chic ensemble. It could best be described as worn out. It consisted of an old Hawaiian shirt and tattered shorts that appeared to have originally been long pants. When he approached, he spoke in cheerful Creole. I knew he was trying to scam me, but I asked him to sit down. Any guy who manipulated this well should have known better. I bought him a drink and told him that I had just moved here and wanted to learn how to thrive in the St. Lucian culture. I told him he looked like the right guy for it, so I offered to pay him to teach me everything I needed to know to be successful in his company. His manner changed from cheerful to cunning. I saw him thinking about angles. I also saw that he was a really smart guy. He switched to completely clear French accented English and said, "How about you have some free fun with me, Mon? I'll teach you enough that they'll think you were born here, and you can pay for all the food and drinks." I laughed and said, "Why do I feel like I'd be better off if I just gave you a couple $1,000s?" He laughed and said, "That would be it. It would definitely be." It was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Almost every night, he and Buddy and I would sit at Spinacres all night listening to the music, which was really, really good. Buddy and I would then return to the boat while Jean-Claude went off to look for another victim. He never seemed to sleep. Jean-Claude took me everywhere and introduced me to everyone, and when he finished, I felt like I could run for mayor of Castries. One of the most disturbing consequences of my divorce was my complete lack of interest in sex. In fact, this could be extended to my attitude towards women in general. I didn't know whether the fear of betrayal was keeping my desire for female company under lock and key, or whether it was a case of sexual dysfunction due to my sudden change in fate. But I had no interest in interacting with any woman under any circumstances, no matter how hot she was. It actually took 6 months after the day Bernie told me I was single again before I started looking at women that way again. I was now at the stage where I could appreciate a slender female body in revealing clothing, but I was still very aware that each of their beating hearts was full of duplicity. At this time of year, there were more cruise ships in Castries Bay than there were ships off the coast during the Normandy invasion. Most towns north of the border were still relatively uneasy, and all these giants landed passengers on our little island. Jean-Claude must have been right in the middle of it all, because he called me and said, "I have a family who wants an excursion to Martinique. Pick them up at Sandals Halcyon at Tenozard. Good money for you and me, mon. Name Wilson." He pronounced it like Wilson. Jean-Claude lived for moments like these. The Sandals resort he was talking about was down the coast, outside the town of Castries on the Rodney Bay side. I said, "Thank you, my friend, and you can take your share tomorrow." He laughed and said, "Take your time. You're acting like a tourist, mon. I'll get it later," and hung up. An hour later, I pulled up to the Sandals dock on the diesel. Buddy sat in his usual place on the bow, looking just like a kinescope figure, puffing, 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 puffing. I assumed that the family would consist of dad, mom, and children. But it turned out that this is a family in the sense of brothers, sisters, and spouses. There were 5 of them, 2 men and 3 women, ranging in age from about 20 to a guy who looked to be in his mid-30s. A woman in her early 30s was slender and had the words "housewife from Yuppie." She was clearly with the oldest guy. Then there was a woman about the same age as the wife who looked so similar to the first guy that she had to be his sister. She was tall, and she had this aggressive physique with huge breasts that screamed hot. But she was wearing trousers, not shorts, like a plain woman. It was an interesting contrast of messages. It was obvious that she was married to another guy because she was hugging him, even though he looked several years younger. The woman, who was single, was in her mid-20s. She was undoubtedly the younger sister. This one was a real beauty. Since I first saw Janet, I have never seen such a combination in one woman. She wore a pair of white sailing shorts and a blue alligator polo shirt. She had thick brown hair that hung below her shoulders. They have been stacked in layers in what has been known as the Rachel for the past decade. She had a golden tan and the most perfectly proportioned features I had ever seen on a woman. She was stunningly beautiful. She was about 5'6" and had great leg muscles and a killer ass. I knew this because she bent down to pick up the refrigerator as I approached the dock. When she turned to come on board, my first impression was athlete. She was incredibly poised and graceful. She had large, round, full breasts. They weren't in Janet's league in size, but there weren't many women's breasts like hers. However, they perfectly complemented her slender figure, not looking too big. She had broad shoulders and thin arms for a woman, and long, smooth muscles on her legs. Janet's hips were full and round. This woman had firm, athletic thighs that simply radiated feminine strength. I had already noticed her protruding ass. But when she turned to put the refrigerator down, I saw that her waist was so narrow that it made her flawless hip structure look almost curvy. I might have lingered a little longer looking at her because she noticed me looking and looked at me with complete disgust. The Cruising 40's cockpit was comfortable and spacious, but a little tight for 6 people and a large dog. I immediately sent Buddy down to the galley. He was happy to go there as I had left some extra rations there to keep him occupied. Besides, so many people made him nervous. 6 of us sat on padded benches as I steered the boat back out to sea under the motor. As soon as we reached the open sea, the eldest sister and her husband disappeared into the cabin. They left the impression that they didn't really like being at sea. It was like they were expecting a visit from Captain Jack Sparrow. I had every island beer in an ice bath and plenty of rum and tequila underneath. The sound of the blender in the galley alleviates any concerns about dissatisfied customers. They were content to sit in the cabin with their margaritas, and it looks like they were there for romance, not sailing. This left only the older brother and his wife, and they sat cheerfully on the bench to the right, watching the water bubble past as we cruised along the shore on the diesel. My only thought was, empty-headed, spoiled, and rich. I saw a lot of this among students at the place where I used to work. As soon as I got into the main sea waves, I raised the mainsail. I could have done it myself, but part of the tour was the opportunity to play with the boat, so I asked for volunteers to help raise the sails. The brother looked at his wife, and they both refused. It was obvious that they believed that it was the hired hands who should hoist the sails, not the owners. I turned to the goddess, and her wish was written on her face. She said, "I've never sailed before, but I'd really love to learn." She stood up as gracefully as a cat and walked towards me at the helm as I righted the boat into the wind. Things can get very interesting if you raise the mainsail and you are not aligned with the wind at the bow. This was something I learned from the initial horror on the way down. I engaged the autopilot and secured the main sail line to the motorized winch. I said, "We'll need this to raise the sail. Once I'm done spinning it, I want you to pull a line through this winch mechanism. Don't stop until you reach the top of the mast. Can you?" She answered enthusiastically, "Yes, Captain." Her gaze was like that of a little girl concentrating on learning to ride a bicycle. It was so touching that I almost forgave her for the fuck off, asshole vibe she was giving off the entire time she was on the boat. We raised the mainsail and jib as efficiently as I ever did with Janet. The woman was undoubtedly a physical specimen, perfectly coordinated and very precise in her movements. I wondered if she was a professional tennis player or something like that. Her rare athleticism was hard to miss. The sails filled as I turned away from the wind at the bow, and we settled on a nice port tack, making perhaps 8 knots. It was so exciting that she even screamed and clapped her hands for joy. The look of delight on her face hinted at deep emotions in other aspects of her soul. I turned to take the helm and adjusted the course 350 degrees. I said, "Enjoy it. There is food and drink below, and if you want to sunbathe, the foredeck is a good place to sunbathe." She gave me my first friendly look since she came on board. She said, "I love the sun. We don't get much of it this time of year in Ann Arbor. Can I just sit in the front? Will someone disturb me? How long until our destination?" I replied, "If the wind holds, we will be there in less than 3 hours. That will be about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Then your group can decide what you want to do. You can stay on the island for a couple of days, which I recommend. I'll pick you up when you want to come back. Another option is to make it a day trip. We can be back around 7 p.m. I'm willing to do whatever makes you guys happy. You are the clients." She said, "Can we decide when we will arrive? What is Martinique like?" I said, "It's the Paris of the Caribbean, that's all. I like visiting distilleries, but I love rum, and they make some of the best in the world. They're supposed to have great shopping, but Buddy and I don't like shopping." Meanwhile, my kinetic friend came out of the cabin and sat down next to the helm. I think the drunk people downstairs were bothering him. He became a true sea dog, a far cry from his street dog origins. Of course, my transformation from academic botanist to sea tramp was no less spectacular. I extended my hand and said, "By the way, my name is Bill Butler." I added jokingly, "It's alliteration, you know. Everyone just calls me Billy Joe. Can I ask your name?" She replied, "My name is Millie Wilson. It's short for Millicent. My sister downstairs is called Marigold. Everyone calls her Mary. My brother is Lance, which is short for Lancelot. My parents had a very strange sense of humor when it came to choosing names. The other guy is someone Mary picked up at the hotel. I don't know his name." It was interesting. I assumed they were married because Mary and the guy were already starting to act out. In fact, they got to the point where I thought we would have to close the cabin hatch to drown out the noise. Both Millicent and Lancelot completely ignored the show. Apparently Mary did this often. I asked, "Which ship are you from?" She replied, "We arrived in Huanora yesterday. My sister Maddie and her husband will be joining us tonight. I used to look after their little boy. His name is Billy too." Then she realized that she had inadvertently hinted that my name was a child's name, and she blushed. I said, "Don't worry about it. I'm from Alabama, and every William there is either Billy Bob or Billy Joe. I take no offense. I gave her a friendly smile and returned to the controls. She gave me a strange, sleepy smile and went ahead to sunbathe. Buddy just sat next to me and drooled. I watched the sails for a while to gauge the wind. When I looked back at the foredeck, I nearly capsized the whole boat. She took off her polo shirt and shorts and laid out a towel to lie on. I was expecting to see her in some sexy bikini. Instead, she wore a microfiber one-piece swimsuit. This covered her body with a decent amount of black cloth, and if it were made of cotton, she would look almost old-fashioned. But because the polymer material was 1 micron thick, every detail and feature of this absolutely gorgeous female body was visible. It looked like there was nothing on it except black paint. To say she had a great body was an understatement. It looked like an idealized drawing of the female anatomy. Janet had a body made for sex, huge breasts, a small waist, and such hips and ass. This woman was made for functionality, speed and strength, slender and smooth. I have never seen a woman who was so amazingly perfect. When they looked at her, images of a cheetah or a Formula One racing car or a supersonic fighter jet appeared in my head, deadly, powerful, and absolutely mesmerizing. This was the female form originally intended by the creator, but perfectly embodied in the flesh. It was delicious. I changed my mind about her being a tennis player. You cannot get such a perfectly toned and at the same time flexible body without many years of dance training. Obviously, it wasn't a ballet. Ballerinas are flat-chested. They need this to maintain straight lines in ballet. This woman had big breasts. I was actually a little disappointed by the flawlessness of her breasts, because the only conclusion I could draw from their absolute perfection was that she bought them. And I'm not interested in a woman who would do this to herself. It just seemed like she wasn't that kind of woman. She simply radiated sincerity, openness, and modesty. I felt the first signs of something emerging. I dropped off my passengers at the pier in Fort-de-France, which is right in the center of the city. The cruise terminal is nearby, and I had a diesel the whole time across the bay of Fort-de-France. This was necessary for management purposes, so as not to end up under the keel of one of the monstrous cruise ships that come and go from there like elephants among mice. I escorted all my passengers to the pier, and then moved into the harbor and lowered the anchors. The entrance to Fort-de-France was a bit like the approach to Calais, with the same promenade and Norman church tower. But the housing, stretching up the surrounding hills, was purely island Creole. They decided to spend the day shopping since they were going to meet their older sister and her family that evening. Mary and her new friend wanted to stay on board and drink, but I convinced them that local distilleries had tasting rooms, so it was worth the trip. Apparently, the prospect of tasting free high-quality rum interested them more than sex. Besides, they've already enjoyed it enough for a while. Mary was a mystery. She was clearly a first-class woman, a strict yuppie, very controlling. At the same time, she spent the 3 hours it took to get to Martinique drinking and hanging out with a stranger who was about 10 years younger than her. I wondered if, deep down, Millie was as insatiable as her sister. On the way to Martinique, Millie spent time on the foredeck working on her tan. She alternately lay on her back and then on her stomach. Whichever side it was on, it distracted me so much that I stopped looking straight at the bow of the ship. There she felt comfortable with her family. In fact, on a short trip to Martinique, Millie and this suit seemed to completely cure me of any sexual dysfunction that Janet might have instilled in me. It was a damn miracle. Luckily, Millie had changed back into her polo and shorts to head to the city. She would have provoked a civil uprising among the male population if she had appeared in Fort-de-France in this costume. "Do you want to come with me?" I replied, "I'd love to, but I need to look after the boat. I hope you have a good time. There are more expensive shops on Rue Victor Hugo, and if you want something to eat, try Chez Carol. A tour of the rum distillery in Le Diamante is something. It's incredible." She said, "Thank you," and shyly squeezed my forearm. What a thrill! I knew what it meant. Buddy and I sat in the sun all day and waited. I usually killed time by playing on the internet or reading. Today, I was just thinking. I got burned badly on a beautiful woman and didn't want to repeat the experience. But this girl, and she was still only in her 20s, seemed different. There was something special about her. There was a sense of strong personal integrity that she just radiated. She was a giver, not a receiver. And in this respect, she was at the opposite pole from Janet. First of all, she was not a vampire. Janet, for all her intelligence and common sense, knew the effect she had on men and was always ready to exploit it. Millie either didn't know she was smoky hot or it didn't matter to her. Janet's intelligence was similar to that of a man's, always in full view of everyone. You could talk to her and understand how smart she was. In some ways, Millie might have been smarter, but this was a woman's intellect, subtle, nuanced, and less obviously self-centered. Did I mention her hostile sexuality? At first, she wanted to burn me at the stake for looking at her. But there was something about the way she moved and carried herself that made me think that once you started her engine, she might be even hotter than Janet. And Janet was like an active volcano. The mention of her sister's children also intrigued me. We were childless because Janet wanted a career. Millie seemed especially fond of children. It fit perfectly with all the other aspects of her personality. And I wanted children. Using the word whole to describe someone is so unfashionable. But that was Millie in a nutshell. She felt comfortable in her skin. She knew who she was and didn't need to prove anything. She was cheerful, open, kind, and spontaneously affectionate. And for the first time in almost 14 months, I started thinking about romance. At that moment, my quiet voice reminded me that I was 16 years older than her. So it's unlikely she would have found me attractive at all. She probably had plenty of hot young 27-year-old studs to take care of her needs at home. But I wondered if she might be willing to try an island fling with an older man, just to get me back in the game, so to speak. There was a lot to think about. They finally called at 7 and told me to come pick them up. The women were laden with bags and boxes from the almost Parisian shopping experience that Martinique offers. The older brother wanted to tell me about the Central Market as if I had never been there. He and his wife then walked forward holding hands. It was somehow innocent and sweet. Mary and her pet fell out of the rum tour and quickly retired to the cabin, closing the hatch behind them. Definitely not a subtle hint. Millie came and sat in the driver's seat with Buddy and me. She was doing that woman thing where they start wanting to get to know you better. The sun setting in the tropics was very romantic and shone over our right shoulder in all its purple and gold glory. She sat on the bench next to the helmsman's chair, her arms wrapped around her magnificent legs, studying me solemnly and watching me steer. I said, "Would you like to try it?" She looked absolutely happy and asked, "Can I?" I moved to let her sit on the bench. I showed her the compass and said, "Make sure the little needle points to 170 and keep it there. A sailboat is like a living creature. The helmsman, the boat, and the wind are all parts of one whole, so control it by feel." She looked at me dreamily and then returned to the steering wheel. She chewed her lower lip, concentrating furiously. It was absolutely sweet. While she was driving, she casually asked, "Were you born here?" I knew where she was going with this. I have not told a single person on this island about my past life. To her, I was a sea tramp, and that is how I remained. I said, "No, I'm from the States, but I want to stay here." I didn't add, "until my heart heals." She said, still fishing, "Do your wife and children live here with you?" I said, "I don't have any, just me and Buddy." She said, "Aren't you lonely?" I replied, "Sometimes." She had no idea how lonely I was, and I was never going to tell her. After this, there was nothing left but to continue swimming in a cozy, friendly atmosphere in the growing darkness. I took the helm when it got dark. She leaned back on the bench, putting her hands behind her head, and said admiringly, "Look at these stars." I replied, "The ocean at night somehow connects you to the universe. It reminds you how small and insignificant you are in the grand scheme of things." Over the past 400-plus days, I've needed a constant reminder that the events in my life mean nothing to anyone else. It helped me keep my sanity. But sitting here with this woman, I began to think about the future instead of the past. This fact scared me. I dropped them off at the Sandals dock. Their tips were generous. Millie became increasingly agitated as we approached the diesels. Finally, she turned to me with concern in her voice. "Can I hire you to show my sister and her family around tomorrow? They need a good guide." I said, "Sure, just call this number," and gave her one of my business cards. I was concerned about how happy it made me. They all walked along the pier, carrying their spoils from the raid on the shops of Martinique. In fact, her brother and his wife walked ahead, holding hands. Mary and her new friend seemed to have had sex several times, judging by the sounds from the cabin staggering around. And Millie walked ahead of everyone with her panther grace. She was an absolutely stunning woman, a trophy any man would be proud of. My phone woke me up at 8 a.m. the next morning. It was Millie, and she sounded incredibly cheerful. I moored the boat and completed the usual post-excursion maintenance by midnight. But for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep under the influence of alcohol. I always left the cabin door open so I could use the toilet at night, and Buddy always slept at the foot of the stairs leading to the cabin for our mutual safety. But for some reason, I closed the door to the cabin, and it was already getting hot there. I think this was a sign of my confused state of mind. Millie said enthusiastically, "My sister and her family want to take a tour. Can you pick us up at the dock again?" I replied, "Where do you want to go?" She replied, "Just around the island." I told them how wonderful it was to be out on the open ocean on your boat. I didn't really need the money, but I wanted to see her again. So an hour later, I was already approaching the same parking spot as the day before. My faithful beast stood at his usual post on the bow, looking as nautical as Lord Horatio Nelson himself. All he needed was a cocked hat, a vest, and a telescope. Millie jumped onto the boat before I could even dock it. There were 7 of them this time, although 4 of them didn't take up much space. There was a woman as strikingly attractive as Millie. She was shorter and had breasts the size of Janet. Her face was as perfectly proportioned as Millie's. And she was just great. She was closer to 40 and was holding the hand of a 4-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl. An older boy, perhaps 12 years old, was helping a girl, who appeared to be about 8 years old, onto the boat. The little girl had the exceptional beauty of her mother. She seemed to have endless admiration for the older boy. It was Dad who alerted me. In fact, he scared me so much that I almost gave up and left. That's because the dad was Bill Hughes. He was an outstanding hacker whom I knew through my work with agencies in Washington. He owned a large penetration testing company in Falls Church, and he would have known Professor William Butler if he still existed. Luckily, Billy Joe, the sea tramp, didn't even remotely resemble that guy, and I hoped that Hughes did not expect to meet me on the island of St. Lucia, but I wished I had a beard. They all climbed on board, the children quite carefully. This was clearly a new experience for all of them. Everyone was given a life jacket, and I went out on the diesel far enough to hoist the sails. While I was moving, the kids were all loving Bad Buddy. He stood there, enduring their attention, but he gave me sidelong glances like, "Save me, boss." I assumed that Millie and I would do the hoisting of the sails, as she was beginning to be proficient at it. But she immediately involved the older boy and girl. She even added a 6-year-old girl to her crew on deck. This girl was obviously an exceptional example of female athletics, just like her aunt. I released the sail and National and her brave team got down to business. They didn't even use a winch. They simply pulled the sail up to the mast. It was something like, "Yo-ho-ho" and a bottle of rum. This particular feat of seamanship was largely due to the fact that the boatswain in charge of the deck crew was probably as strong as I was. On the other hand, it was a wonderful, caring gesture. This was something that only a woman who loved and understood children could do. Her older sister looked at all of them working on the sails with love in her eyes. I was beginning to see what a truly caring family looked like. I was also relieved that her husband Bill, whom she was clinging to like a schoolgirl, clearly had no idea who I was. We made a full circle offshore from Castries around via Fort Bay. I anchored off Sandy Beach and took them to a picnic. This is the best beach on the island, even if the peace is occasionally disturbed by the noise of an airplane arriving at Huanora Airport, which is located right behind the beach. I let Millie lead me part of the way along the coast. She surprised me by asking, "Can Billy try?" Billy was 12 years old. He and Millie seemed to have a special connection. It was almost as if she was his other mother. I have never met a more intelligent, courageous, and respectful child. So, against my better judgment, I said, "Of course." The boy got behind the wheel under Millie's guidance, and the two of them drove the car for several minutes. From his reaction, I realized that the boy would be tied to the sea for the rest of his life. My response to Millie and her sister, Maddie, was interesting. Maddie was the eldest, Millie the youngest, Lance and Mary in the middle. Maddie was every bit Janet. She was incredibly beautiful and voluptuous. She was smart, funny, and as overtly sexy as Messalina herself. Like I said, Janet. When I found out that Maddie was also a Harvard-educated lawyer, that sealed the deal. She was the epitome of Janet, I hope without vulgarity. However, Millie beat Maddie in every category. There was a certain natural strength about Maddie that made her seem seriously self-confident, almost bossy. Millie had the same strength of character and was just as confident and strong, but she was the baby of the family. Therefore, she seemed carefree, intelligent, and focused on others. And of course, that gorgeous body. I almost couldn't look at Millie. She was so heartbreakingly hot. But she wasn't at all self-conscious about how she looked. It was as if she didn't realize that she was a one-in-a-million beauty. With Maddie's kids, Millie was like Peter Pan in The Lost Boys. She was the funniest, and Maddie was the parent. And Millie seemed to think about nothing but how to raise and make every child happy. It spoke volumes about her loving spirit. Maddie's Harvard law degree reminded me that I knew nothing about Millie's past. And make no mistake, at that point, I began to think about Millie in a way that suggested a background check. So I said, "What are you doing, Millie? Do you study in college?" I never asked. She said very casually, as if she was telling me what time it was, "When we get back from vacation, I'll be starting a residency in neonatology at the University of Michigan Hospital." Damn it, was she a medical doctor? It never occurred to me that this hot young woman could be a doctor. It suited her personality perfectly, as she was a giver. But such achievements for someone so young and beautiful had never crossed my mind. Talk about being a condescending weirdo. Thank God no one asked me what I was doing. They just assumed. But my husband, Bill, started looking at me as if trying to decide whether he knew me or not. I wanted to get to know Millie better. This was before I made hasty decisions about returning to the reality of the adult world. I didn't want my cover to be blown, so we packed lunch, and I took them all back to the boat on the Zodiac. When I dropped them off at the dock, Hughes pulled out his wallet and asked me, "How much?" I told him that the trip was to go home. I really enjoyed my day with them. This caused the usual male thought, "Take it. No, you take it." Finally, I told him that if he, Maddie, and Millie would join me for dinner, I would call it fair. They met me at Spinacres at Seven-O's. The two sisters were absolute visions. They were 10 years apart in age, but they would have looked like twins if one could ignore the fact that Maddie was 4 inches shorter. They both wore light linen dresses with tropical prints. Both of these dresses showed off her gorgeous legs and gorgeous breasts. They were completely fascinated by this place. I knew they would. 3 dudes were doing something with steel drums and guitars that was so quintessentially Creole that it seemed like they'd been hired to perform the Caribbean cliché of the evening. I liked Millie's eyes. They sparkled every time she looked at me. She was amazing tonight. Both sisters had the same perfectly balanced facial features that were a delight to the eye. You felt drawn into their faces every time you looked at them. but fully made up, Millie's eyes and cheekbones, as well as her wide, sensual mouth, simply pulled me in like gravity. All my internal alarms were sounding. I fell in love with this amazing creature. I already once substituted under attack by one beautiful woman. I absolutely did not want to give a chance to someone who was younger and even hotter than the woman who burned me. But the attraction was inevitable. For the first time in 14 months, I didn't think about my ex-wife. Instead, I thought about the beautiful woman sitting across from me and wondered where the future might take us. And I was counting on my role as a beach bum to save me from committing rash acts with Millie Wilson. While I was one of the local residents, I could recognize this charming person, and at the same time, perhaps I could get into her heart. I was afraid that if she got to know me without understanding what I had to offer, she would dismiss me as the dirty old man I was beginning to feel like. After all, I was considering winning her heart in very hot and sweaty conditions. At that moment, Maddie's husband completely destroyed all my hopes. Certainly, Billy Joe Butler has always been some vengeful god's personal punching bag. Husband Bill said with complete surprise, "I was trying to figure out if I knew you, and I have to ask you." Oh shit, here it is. Are you Billy Joe Butler? And you know which Billy Joe Butler I'm talking about. I thought about trying to lie and get out, but they were good people, and I owed them respect. I said, rather with shame, "Yes, I am that Billy Joe Butler." He said, "What the hell are you doing here? I would never recognize you." I replied, "I got into trouble, and when all the pieces fell to the ground, they landed me in St. Lucia." He asked, "What about Janet? Is she here too?" Millie looked like she was about to cry. She said in awe, "Janet?" I said wearily, "She was the problem. We got divorced over a year ago. I'm here to put myself back together after my life fell apart." He said, "What about?" And before he could finish his thought, I said, "I know what you're going to ask. I'm taking a sabbatical. I'll be back there in less than 4 weeks." Maddie said, "Wait a minute. We all thought you were some island guy. Are you saying you're actually a famous academic in the States?" The cat was so clearly out of the bag that I decided to just shoot it and be done with it. I said, "Yes, I'm a professor there, and the reason your husband knows me is because we both work for the National Counterterrorism Center." I turned to Millie, who was silently crying. I said, "I'm sorry, Millie. I've lived the sea life for so long that the person they're talking about is really a different person. I sincerely hope that you will understand that I was not trying to deceive you. I've just spent the last 14 months suffering because of what my wife did to me, and suddenly I began to have real feelings for another person. I know it sounds cocky, but you really were able to restore my faith in women, and I just didn't want to mix it up with the rest of my sad story." She looked at me and said, "You should have been honest with me. I was falling in love with you." Then she stood up, turned to her brother-in-law, and said with quiet dignity, "Take me home. Dinner is at his expense," and left the establishment. I was used to my relationships with women ending in disaster, so I didn't follow her. Sadness fell over me as I walked back to my only true friend. He greeted me with his usual dog sniff. "Welcome back, boss. It didn't work out again, I see." It was hard to leave my happy life in St. Lucia, but my sabbatical leave was over, and I would have owed the university a year's salary if I had not returned to class the day after Labor Day. Millie's situation had torn the scab off the deep wound that Janet had inflicted, and it felt like I was bleeding again. It was kind of awkward, actually. I have contempt for any man who continues to play the role of a heartbroken weakling 16 months after a divorce. But that's exactly what I did. Strangely, I was grieving the loss of Millie, not Janet. I packed my things and left. Jean-Claude was there to see me off. I gave him the savings I had put aside in case I decided to stay. We earned them together. He almost looked like he was going to give them up. You have to know Jean-Claude to understand how touching it was. Money is sacred to him. He shouted after me, "Good luck, my friend, and goodbye," and then disappeared from sight around the bend of the bay. It was hot in the Florida Channel. The first storm of the hurricane season was already approaching, and I barely made it through before encountering a situation that actually required lifeboats. As soon as I got into the coastal waters, the sea calmed down. But the journey was still very gloomy, at least as far as my state of mind was concerned. Bill the Islander was dead, and I returned to reality, but there was no love there. I cut my hair to business professional standards. They were still white and blonde, and people with a tan like mine were rare in Washington, so I stood out. Plus, I was now more like dry skin, rather than soft and plump like most around me. But I returned to the role of Professor William Butler, a lonely bachelor. As I walked out of the classroom after a morning lecture during the second week of classes, I saw Maddie leaning casually against the wall. Honestly, it was a shock. She was absolutely the last person I expected to see in real life. She was wearing the same clothes as the rest of the students, a short pleated skirt and sweater, bare legs, and boat shoes without socks. But it was impossible not to notice her. She was perhaps the most beautiful woman in the hallway, if not on the entire campus, perhaps even in all of Washington. God, how beautiful she was. I was surprised to see her and curious as to why she was there, so I walked over. I got the impression that she was used to people approaching her, not the other way around. I said, "Hi, Maddie. I never thought I'd see you again." She pushed herself off the wall and stood in front of me. She placed her hands on my shoulders at arm's length. She just studied me silently. Her facial expression was unreadable. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. It was as if I was her 4-year-old child who had just shit himself in public. She didn't know what to do with me. Finally, she said, "Is there a place where we can talk in private?" I thought, "Ooh, is there a problem?" I said, "My office is right upstairs if you want to go there, or we can go to Tombs if you want to talk in a more public place." She said, "I could use a cup of coffee," and walked toward the parking lot without even looking back to see if I was following. She was undoubtedly a very confident lady. I arrived by metro, so she had to drive me. Along the way, we exchanged general information to get to know each other. It turned out that she lives in the Palisades area, very close to the university, so coming to me was not a problem for her. I also didn't have to ask how she knew where I was, because my schedule for every Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m. is published on the internet. This is one of the conveniences of online scheduling. It turns out her husband Bill was watching the children. We found a table and we both ordered coffee. Everyone in the cafe was trying to figure out who Maddie was. She looked even more attractive than Janet in the category of exotic beauty, with curvy figures that attracted the attention of every man. Those who knew my true story exchanged glances of approval. Maddie is a lawyer, and lawyers have a way of getting to the heart of the matter. Since I didn't think she had come to invite me to one of the kids' birthdays, I knew what we were going to talk about, so I decided to get ahead of the conversation. I said, "If Millie thought I was deceiving her, I want to apologize again. You see how different the world is here and there. Evidence of this is all around us." Everyone in the cafe was having serious conversations about classes or work. I had only known your sister for 2 days at that time, and it seemed inappropriate for me to try to explain my complicated history. She looked at me intently. Her eyes were full of intelligence and unshakable strength. She said, "Okay, then tell me now." I took a deep breath and said, "I was happily married to a woman who was almost as beautiful as you and Millie. She was my best friend, lover, and life partner. I never thought that my idyllic world would ever change. But I caught her cheating with her boss. In her defense, I'm sure she would never have betrayed me if he hadn't been so persistent. It was one of those unfortunate events where all the conditions for betrayal coincided at the same time. However, when she cheated, it was a perfect storm. In fact, she cheated with such selfish shamelessness that it destroyed every aspect of our special marriage, and suddenly nothing in my life seemed secure anymore. If you ask me honestly, I don't think she would do it again. but I wouldn't bet on it. However, watching her do all those slutty things with that man had an impact on what the polarity of our relationship has changed. I was always very attracted to her, but after I witnessed what she did in that hotel room, I was also very repulsed. Even worse, she was so filled with remorse and regret after that that I was pulled back into her orbit, and I would have lost all respect for myself as a man if I had allowed that to happen. So I decided to create a barrier between us by going somewhere else, a place where I could get my thoughts in order. The version of me you met there was Island Bill, the happy beach bum. I've practically decided that living in celibacy would be preferable to the pain that a woman in your life might cause, and I really liked the simple world there. Then I met your sister. Something about her cured all my trust issues. It was a completely incomprehensible reaction. I didn't even think about it. It happened instantly. She's so real and unpretentious and kind. It was like a miracle. There I acted like a little child, hiding from the facts of my real life. Then I met her. Suddenly, I wanted a woman to respect me again. I wanted to live up to the standards she set for me. I could trust in her and her fundamental honesty and integrity. And for the first time in 14 months, my life had direction and purpose. I was strong again, and I could deal with anything, including Janet's betrayal. Everything fell apart when your husband exposed me and she left. I just hope that Millie understands that I wasn't trying to deceive her for some undignified reason. I just wanted some time to try and convince her that, despite my years, I could be a good fit for her if she ever considered letting me into her life. Maddie snorted. She said sarcastically, seriously, for such a smart guy, you're really dumb. I can't believe you didn't see that Millie was in love with you from the moment she saw you and that smelly dog. I'm sure the representatives of the sexes are all absolutely narrow-minded. Millie saved my marriage when Bill suffered from the same type of dementia, and now it's time for me to save her. Yes, she was a little upset when she found out that you weren't who you said you were, but she expected you to call the next day and explain everything. It just destroyed her when you suddenly disappeared without another word. You must have some serious self-esteem issues, Pilgrim. I wouldn't be here if she weren't suffering so much, but she's been on edge for the last 5 weeks, and I'm tired of waiting for you to finally shake yourself up. So I decided to push the story. Millie will be in town tomorrow, and I expect you to set the record straight. This was said in a tone that brooked no argument. I said, but she is the most stunningly attractive woman I have ever known. She is magnificent, the perfect example of feminine beauty. She's a doctor of medicine and 16 years younger than me. Surely she has a million more attractive and suitable suitors. Maddie shook her head and laughed bitterly. Like I said, stupid. She said, women fall in love with men. Men are not involved in this decision. None of you even have the slightest idea how intimacy works. If it were up to you, humans would have died out eons ago. It probably has to do with a woman's responsibility to bear children, but our decision to be with someone is a difficult choice, and we make that decision on our own. When a woman finds the right person, she understands it. It's some kind of atavistic ability that we have. It's a combination of chemistry, maybe your upbringing and inclination. It's also partly instinctive. You just see that you can share your life with this man, and a smart woman recognizes that right away. And the only way a woman can mess things up is if she doesn't listen to what her instincts are telling her. When a woman, like Millie, decides to love a man, the only requirement is that the man has the strength to step forward and strengthen the connection. Until now, you have been acting like a typical idiot. You think too much and have no self-confidence at all. But given your history with women, it's understandable. You'll assure you that no one has a greater sense of loyalty and devotion than Millie. She's the youngest in the family. I practically raised her. I know she would never betray you like that other woman. It's just not in her nature. Millie wants to share her life with you. So tomorrow you should meet her at DCA Airport and take her somewhere where you can talk everything over. You need her in your life as much as she needs you. Just do it. Okay, Maddie is really bossy. but she's also a true force of nature. Her mental strength simply radiated from her. However, she meant what she said, and I believed her. She gave me the arrival information. She added, "If I don't see her this week, that will be totally fine. In fact, I'd prefer not to because it will mean you're making amends. And let me assure you, you will never regret what you did, because Millie is the best woman you, or any man, could ever find in your life. She will make you happy." With that, she stood up and said, "I hope to see you at all the family events." And without another word, she turned and left. I sat there, stunned. The roller coaster had reached the bottom and was now rapidly soaring to the top of some as yet unexplored height. And this time I wasn't going to miss the ball. The next day, I stood in the area where passengers go through the final TSA check in Terminal 3 at Reagan Airport. It would be putting it mildly to say that I was nervous. I was probably more confident walking to Susie Franklin's door on the night of my junior prom with acne on my face. The last time I saw Millie, she was leaving my life. As far as I knew, there was an equal chance that she might decide to tell me what she thought of me in front of all her fellow travelers, or she may pass me by without even acknowledging me. To be honest, I didn't know why I was standing here. But as the song says, a pale heart never wins a fair lady. She walked through the passage, dragging her little suitcase bag. She was the epitome of feminine beauty, dressed in the deadly grace of a great hunting cat. Every man behind her was appreciating her legs and ass. Everyone who watched her approach could not take their eyes off her magnificent breasts. An image of another beautiful woman appeared in my mind, dragging your suitcase along the platform to the train. I was overcome by a burning pain. My inner voice mockingly remarked, "You really are a hopeless coward." That pain was completely destroyed by the events of the next few seconds. When she saw me standing there, the emotions on her beautiful face were crystal clear and extremely eloquent. In about 5 seconds, Millie went from the boredom of a traveler to disbelief of her eyes to pure unmixed joy. She was just like her sister, absolutely self-confident and self-sufficient. That's why she didn't rush to me and throw herself into my arms crying. Instead, she calmly walked up to me and said, "Where is the car?" It was as if she expected me to be there. I politely offered to take her bag. She also politely refused. The women of the Wilson family carry their own bags. It was a long walk to the car. She walked next to me in her 4-inch heels that showed off her amazing legs. She lightly held my hand. Anyone who saw us would think that we had been married for many years. We didn't exchange words. We didn't need words. When we got to the car, I said, "It's going to be crowded on the boat, so I booked a room at Madison if that's okay for you. Otherwise, you can stay with your sister." She looked at me like I was a complete idiot and said, "Why should I stay with my sister?" I made a reservation at Old Ebbitt for 7 p.m. We talked a little while driving down Massachusetts Avenue from Highway 395. Both knew that conversations would follow after dinner. I told her a little about my journey back. She told me about the start of her new residency. Her love for children simply overwhelmed her. We still had some time, so I checked in first. I booked one of the suites at Madison, so I sat in the living room while she changed in the bedroom. I heard the sound of a shower, and a few minutes later, she came out of the bedroom wearing what was obviously just a robe. Under the fabric, events of indescribable proportions took place. I stood up as she began to walk towards me, completely at ease. She said with some urgency in her voice, "Let's get this over with." This was our first kiss. Millie was the first woman in 15 months. I haven't kissed anyone since that fateful last day with Janet. We made love. She was afraid that I might interpret her extremely passionate behavior as vulgarity, instead of realizing that it was actually her gift to me. I had to tell her that I understand the difference. I said, "You are an incredible woman. What we just shared has created a special bond between us that I hope we can keep for a lifetime, or at least until I become incapacitated at age. I want to spend this life with you. I know it's a little early, but we need to talk about our future together." One possible response to this statement could be, "What are you talking about? I just wanted sex." But I was counting on Maddie to be right. As usual, Maddie was right. The pure joy that spread across her exquisite face was satisfying. She said almost shyly, "I'm yours if you want me." It was incredible. She was significantly younger than me, an absolutely stunning beauty, a successful professional who had made her way in the man's world, and might I add, the hottest woman in the solar system. And so she humbly offers herself to me as if she is not everything a man could ever want, wrapped up in one wonderful package. I thank the Lord for women's insecurities. I said, "We have a lot to talk about, but I can't imagine my life without you." An hour later, we were dropped off at Old Ebbitt. It was a short ride down 16th Street and then H to 15th. I chose this place not so much because it was Grover Cleveland's favorite place. I chose it because of the quiet and very private booths where you can have a meaningful evening conversation. I was proud to be by her side. She looked incredible in a simple black dress and pearls, with patent leather pumps to go with the ensemble. Her muscular legs looked great in heels. She didn't try too hard to show off her breasts, but they were so tightly bunched up and naturally high on her chest that it would have been impossible to wear a cutout dress without showing a lot of cleavage. During our impromptu sexual encounter, I answered one unresolved question. I now knew from close and lengthy inspection that no silicone had been used in the creation of these magnificent molds. They were all Millie Wilson. We ordered, and then I turned to her and said, "So can I assume I've been forgiven for not being as clear as I should have been about my status?" She chuckled and said, "You deserve forgiveness." I said, "Do you want me to tell you my whole story?" She said, "Maddie notified me last night. When I heard it, I cried. What a tragic situation. You must have loved her very much." Okay, everything is at stake. I took a deep breath and said, "I love you so much more. I have loved you since that first night on the boat under the stars. I love you for your wonderful caring spirit and the way you treat children. I love your humble, selfless soul. I love your cheerful love for life and will love you forever if you accept me. I know I'm much older than you, but I'm in good shape. I have a good job, and you'll never doubt my loyalty or desire to be with you." Her eyes sparkled with tears. She said, "What does this mean? What are you telling me?" It was clear that she knew exactly what I was talking about, but this flirt wanted me to say it out loud. Sighing once again into battle, dear friends, I said, "If you agree to marry me, I swear you won't regret it." She grabbed my hands across the table and said, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. I will make you the happiest person in the world." The sun was out, the grass was green, little bluebirds were chirping, beautiful butterflies were fluttering around, and suddenly my future looked absolutely perfect. But the gods loved to play tricks on me. At that very moment, Janet appeared next to the table in a literal cloud of smoke. I could almost smell the sulfur. I haven't seen her since she stood in the back of the auditorium 15 months ago. She smiled at me enthusiastically and said, "It's wonderful to see you, Billy." Meeting her here was not an accident. Old Ebbitt is a gathering place for Washington's influential people, and the man standing behind it with a possessive air looked like one of them. I should have known about this, damn it. He was about 50, wearing one of those $4,000 silk suits that K Street guys love. He was tall, beautifully built, sleek, handsome, and incredibly smug. He didn't look like Mr. Todd Breckenridge. Janet, dressed in a silk evening dress, was as attractive and sexy as always. She is a beautiful woman, and when she is trying to impress like she is now, she looks stunning. She also wore a ring that was almost bigger than the iceberg that sank the Titanic. It didn't take long. So much for never replacing me. Janet's appearance as Beelzebub at the happiest moment of my life was one of those curveballs that fate loves to throw at my head. But this time I accepted their challenge and won the game. If Janet had shown up looking like this the day before, I probably would have thrown my hands up and ran out of the room. But now sitting next to me was my beautiful, wonderful, and unshakable woman who had just agreed to become mine forever, and with her next to me, I was invincible. I was Hercules standing on Superman's shoulders. I stood up and slowly turned to my ex-wife. She looked at me full of hope. She seemed to expect me to leave Millie and her husband right there in Old Ebbet and go with her. I said with all the kindness I could muster, "It's good to see you too, Janet." It was clear from her appearance that my appearance puzzled her. Janet was used to seeing me plump and pale. Since she last saw me, I had turned into a tanned athlete, and I could see from the sexual interest that flashed in her eyes that she appreciated the transformation. Millie was probably as shocked as I was. This could have turned into a complete disaster for both of us, but my girlfriend is a warrior. And of course, she had the advantage of a good upbringing and a few extra ick points. She rose from her seat with natural, effortless grace. This way Janet and her husband could fully appreciate everything about her neat little black dress. They both studied Millie from the top of her thick brown hair down that gorgeous dancer's body to the tips of her dainty little feet. This sight alone would intimidate any woman, given Millie's perfect form and gorgeous face. But she was also almost 4 inches taller than Janet, so she looked down on her. Janet looked at me, confused, as if asking, "Who the hell is she?" Millie held out her hand, completely self-sufficient, and said, "I'm very pleased to see you, Janet. Billy has said so many flattering things about you that I feel as if I knew you. Now that I've met you, I see that he even underestimated your beauty. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Millie Wilson, Billy's fiancée." Janet looked absolutely stunned. Millie was clearly a decade younger than her, just as beautiful and several notches hotter on the feminine scale. And she's a doctor. I almost felt sorry for this cheater. Millie turned to Janet's husband and said, "It's nice to see you too, sir." This "sir" should have offended him because he was twice her age. Janet's husband looked at Millie as if he had fallen in love right there in the restaurant. What man would not want her? A body so hot and a face so attractive it's hard to resist. My absolutely outstanding woman was a sight for the gods. Janet regained her voice. She said in absolute amazement, "Doctor, you teach at a university? I'm the vice president there. I don't think I've ever heard of you." Millie replied, "No, I'm a doctor, not a PhD. I specialize in neonatology at University Hospital in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Billy asked me to marry him, and I said yes, so I'll probably transfer to George University Hospital, Washington to continue his residency." Game, set, and match for Millie Wilson. She couldn't have said it any clearer. She seemed to have put up a no trespassing sign, and she had every reason for this. I must have taken some perverse pleasure from the stunned look on Janet's face, but I almost felt sorry for her. She looked embarrassed, then turned pale. She may have been married to another man, but she obviously still had hopes. Millie's declaration was a windshield to Janet's expectations. Janet took a second to compose herself, and then she said cheerfully, "Well, that's great. Sydney and I have only been married 8 months. We're planning a honeymoon to Europe as soon as we have time." This seemed to be news to her husband. "You will have to send us an invitation to your wedding." I thought the pigs would fly before this happened. I've already been to one wedding with Janet's participation. Was there, and he did it. However, I simply smiled and said, "Of course, Janet, and it was nice to see you." I kissed her on the cheek. It was a social gesture. I didn't feel anything while doing this. I had a gorgeous woman standing next to me, with whom I knew I would grow old. Any hidden grief or personal torment from the past evaporated the moment Millie said, "I do." After all, thoughts of revenge seemed petty. I turned to Janet's husband, who looked at her as if she had lost her mind, and extended my hand to him. I said, "And congratulations to you, Sydney. Janet will make you very happy, as she will make me. I wish you all the best." He looked skeptical. Already having trouble in paradise? How wonderful! Without another word, they both turned and Janet walked out of my life forever. She walked holding the hand of her new husband. She was now completely in the past. I turned to my future wife and said, Shall we go back to our room? We have a lot to plan. She grinned and said, You won't be planning much tonight. I have other plans first, and I don't think you'll be getting much sleep. We have a whole life ahead of us to plan. Millie and I stood together during commencement week at the Naval Academy. We had just celebrated our 9th anniversary, and our lives seemed to only get better. Her nephew Billy, with whom she had a special bond, was one of the new cadets. He grew into the respected, courageous guy I first met at the helm of the boat. And tonight he will head to Nas Pensacola for a career that will no doubt be Top Gun. The other children stood next to Bill and Maddie. I have a special connection with the next oldest girl named Chelsea. She is now 18 and arguably surpasses her mother and aunt in the beauty category, which is an exceptional achievement. But like her mother and aunt, she has a lot going for her than her stunning beauty. She's a true genius in all those nerdy areas that I'm an expert in, especially computational mathematics. That's why we're so close. I tried to get her to come to my university, but she had her sights set on MIT. However, no matter where she is, she will always have Uncle Billy as her best friend and mentor. At 36, Millie is out of the age window for having children. Over the 9 years of our marriage, she became one of the leading neonatologists in the country. But hospital life is not at all for Millie. Instead, she traveled to all third world countries with Doctors Without Borders. She mainly created advanced pediatric institutions, but she always found time to directly help local children. Therefore, in every place she visited, she was greeted as a healing saint. What the rest of her family does not know is that her travels are now over. Because we're expecting twin girls in 6 short months, and like her sister, Millie takes motherhood seriously. So she'll be taking a few years off to raise our daughters. She often told me that her career accomplishments were nothing compared to the opportunity to raise our children. And I believe her. She's just that kind of person. I have no lesson to conclude my story other than this. Life will throw mud at you, but it will also give you the occasional key to your happiness. Therefore, it is important to continue pumping water out of the boat until this lifeline appears, and then grab it with all your might and hold on to it with all your might. And most of all, never doubt your luck. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.